I actually just finished reading Bridge to Terabithia with my 9-year-old at home. And we both look forward to that night of reading one chapter together every night, while my toddler waits for his turn with the picture book. So as a mom to 9-year-old and a toddler, I truly admire children's books authors because they bring so much joy and inspiration to the kids and the family like us. Shobha Tharoor is a renowned children's author, poet, a translator, and known for her captivating storytelling and dedication to fostering a love for literature in young readers. Shobha Tharoor talks to Nirmala Govindarajan about writing for children. Let's listen to them.
Thank you and hello once again. Thanks Ala for having us over. And it's a pleasure to share stage with Shobha. Although I've seen her at several literature festivals, sat down and listened to her sessions, it's a unique pleasure to be on stage with you. Thank you.
My pleasure too, Nirmala. Thank you.
You know, whenever I see Shobha at the literature festivals, she wears sunshine in her smile and a sense of wonder in her eyes. The same kind of wonder that she brings to the hearts of children who read her books. Take us through to that day in your life when you knew you had a story to tell and that it will be read by a child.
That's an interesting question and asked very differently. But first of all, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for tearing through your lunch so you could come here. I'm hoping that and thank you to Ala for inviting me. The next few years, we're going to see packed audiences and all of this once the word gets out, right?
Yeah.
When did I know that I had a heart of a children's writer, in a sense? I'll tell you, essentially that was when I was a mother, but I did write children's stories, or rather stories, as a child. All of us are storytellers. That's what I tell everyone, including the kids I meet. We all have stories to tell, and as we get older, we all want an audience to listen to our stories. So the impulse to write and to share is always there. But I've also have increasingly, living in this world where I see myself as a global citizen, where I've been straddling 2 continents of life. My mother's getting older, and when I was raising the children, I went to India every year. Now I go 3 times a year to India. We're living between places, and I feel like I inhabit so many different roles. I've been running into a lot of children in India, even before I started writing. And I feel that it's a privilege, since I like to write. I love words. As a voiceover talent as well, I use my words. As a person who's always loved the written word as well as the spoken word, using that gift to be able to share that love with others is something that occurred to me as I used to make up stories for my children, and now as a grandmother I make up stories for my grandchildren. I felt that you have something to share it, but share it in a way that keeps them wanting to come back for more. So there is an imperative to sort of make it interesting enough. We have so many distractions today. Just because I loved reading when I was a child, I can't necessarily feel that children today will want to read, because they've got many other ways of being entertained. But I would like to be able to, with my stories, with my poems, with what I write, share with them the joy that I had. Tell them how you can use, there is a passive activity when you're doing a Nintendo or a video game or something. You're being entertained. A lot of the picturization, the visualization, all of that is there for you to look at. So it's passive. Whereas if you read, you can use your own imaginative mind to come up with descriptions and thoughts and all of that. Yeah. So keeping all of those things in mind and a little bit of that grandmother in me, I realized that I had something to share, and the books have been resonating with children, so I continue to do it.
What was the first story you realized?
So the first story I wrote was a story about rabbits.
Okay.
When I think I must have written it when I was 8 or 10 years old. And what was interesting is my father, who worked for a newspaper, had heard about these junior sections in the paper. He sent it off to, I think it was the Hindustan Times Sunday section. And I guess a month or 2 later, my story was published. And seeing your byline is the best way to want to continue to write.
Yeah.
But the story was about rabbits, there was a little adventure. And as I've told children today, obviously at that time, that's the kind of books that I was reading. We were all reading Enid Blyton's and, those kind of things at that age. Yeah. And the stories were inspired by it. Always write about stories that are within your own realm is how I feel. Yeah. I read today children's stories about worlds that they've never inhabited, and I tell them that they're such good writers, but if they could write about the world they inhabit, it would be of interest as well to readers.
Yeah. Even as I sift through the pages of your books, I hear the voice of a narrator, who brings seemingly complex themes to life in a simple yet poetic manner, although it's written for children, I noticed that.
Thank you, Nirmala.
And especially in telling the story of, say, Raja Ravi Varma and his works, which is such an imperative story for children to know, but it hardly reaches a child's bookshelf if it isn't told the way it has been told by you. Right. So tell us about how you kind of do that, bring these complex themes to page, and if you'd like to read an excerpt from any of the works.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah. So the Ravi Varma book, when I was growing up, we went home to see our grandmother in the village in Kerala. Though I was not born and brought up in Kerala, I used to go to Kerala every year. And in my grandmother, in one of her large rooms, we had pictures of Ravi Varma paintings on the wall from the Puranas, and they were springboards for storytelling sessions with our ammais and our, aunts and uncles, and even my grandmother would tell us stories by when we pointed as pictures. Ravi Varma was part of our growing up years. And Ravi Varma is one of India's great modern artists. Modern in the sense that he was one of the first Indian artists who broke from the East India Company tradition, used European realism techniques, but to talk about Indian themes. And yet there were so many children, I agree if Indian children in America don't know who he is, but a lot of children in India didn't know it. So this is a particular book, actually, that I had written in a poetic form. I thought, I was reading these children's, I don't know if any of you have seen these hardcover books that we buy for our kids in America, where they have the art of the artists. So, they have Picasso, Monet, Manet, Van Gogh. All of these artists are there in these little board books where they have the art and then like 3 or 4 lines of poetry describing the art. So I thought I'll do something like that. And I was having tea, and luckily I go to India often enough. I ran into one of the publishers of Westland, Karthika, who is a Malayali, and I was chatting with her, and I said, nobody knows Ravi Varma. I have something to pitch to you. I have this book that I've written, and she said, I'd love a book about Ravi Varma. What a brilliant idea. However, I want an illustrated biography because his art is in the public domain. Since he died a long time ago, we don't need copyrights to put his pictures of his art in our books. So he was a good artist to pick.
Yeah.
And so she said, can you write us a prose illustrated biography? And I thought, oh gosh, because I'd already written. I said, never say never. And I said, sure, why not? Somebody's offering me to publish a book.
Yeah.
I went home, and what was interesting about that book, and I'm sorry it's a long story, is I had to think about a way to write the book that would be interesting to children. The reason I say that is most of the biographies that we look at, a lot of dates, a lot of facts, a lot of specific sort of historical timelines, and then, of course, the images. And I thought, will children even want to read the book? So I spent about a month, believe it or not, thinking about a way of framing the book. And it's a very simple thing that I did, but this book even won an award, and it resonated. Amitabh Bachchan used it as a clue on Kaun Banega Crorepati. So, it's a book that's really captured the imagination in India. The reason is I wrote the book by framing it with a double narrative. So what I did is I have the story of a 8 or 10 or 12-year-old child, it could be a girl or a boy, who doesn't know who Ravi Varma is. And the reason is, in the beginning in the classroom, the teacher says, can you tell us about some artists? And she says Van Gogh, and the teacher smiles. And then somebody says Ravi Varma, Raja Ravi Varma. And the teacher's much more excited because it's an Indian artist. And so this girl goes home, or the boy goes home and tells the parent, Raja Ravi Varma, was that here? Raja who did some painting? Who is this? Who, and it's called Prince with a Paintbrush, the book. And the mother says, okay, let's discover. So the child is discovering the story of the artist. So we have that discovery. And every time the child has questions, I put it with little comic. I didn't put it, but the illustrator has, and it was an idea I had. We have comic bubbles in which the child is thinking. So for instance, when we encounter the timeline of the fact that Ravi Varma got married at the age of 18 to a 12-year-old, the child says, oh my God, I mean, I'm 8 years old. If, I have to get married at 12 in 4 years, thank God times have changed. Yeah. And what was interesting is when kids read this book, many of them came to me and said they liked the story so much because the kid was asking the questions that were in their mind. Yes. So that is a unique thing to do.
Yeah.
In addition, at the end of the book, I put in fun facts that are separate from the story just because they interested me when I was researching, and I figured kids would enjoy it. So, for instance, he was born in a village called Kilimanur in Kerala that didn't even have a post office. But because his art was sent off abroad he's never been abroad, by the way, he died at an early age, and early in the sense in his 50s, and he had never been abroad, but he traveled all over India. His art had gone to the Chicago Festival of Religions, it had gone to Vienna, he won an award there, and so as a result of it, it had piqued people's interest,
yes.
And so again, we talk about the child saying, I could have painted if I had had people traveling with me, or I could have done certain things. But I put all of that. The bubbles were in the book. The fun facts were about the fact that a post office had to be set up in Kilimanur just to bring in all this fan mail that was coming in from all over the country.
Yeah.
We talk about the fact that a lot of the background of his big paintings that were done, he was commissioned to do 14 paintings in Baroda. And, and it was given a huge sum of money and was told to do it in a certain period of time. He did something that I didn't realize, but nowadays I know because we're sort of distantly related to Anjali L. Menon, so I've heard it from her as well. You get a lot of the background work done by other people, and then the main artist is doing, like some writers, script writers for the President of America, you have somebody else doing the writing and then they deliver the speech. So or the politicians. I mean, I've heard Modi ji's speeches in English are definitely written by other people.
Absolutely.
So there we are, and so the artist had his sister, who was a very good artist, painting. Sister and brother did a lot of the background. But then they got her married off and she never became an artist.
Oh.
So, the child is discovering these things and commenting on these things. So that makes it unusual.
Yeah.
The other thing that I've done is I do feel that there needs to be a takeaway, Nirmala, and thank you for giving me an opportunity to share that. I think children's books are not static. The reason I say this is that you can read a mystery novel for adults. Once you've solved the mystery, you're not going to go back necessarily and pick up the book and read it again, unless it was a literary piece of work in which you're learning something about craft or language or whatever else. But if you're writing, if you're reading a James Hadley Chase, which I read as a teenager, many of them, I can't even remember. One story ran into another. I thoroughly enjoyed it while I was reading it, but I don't remember it. Never went back to read it again.
Yeah.
Whereas a children's book, you discover so much at every different stage. So even a picture book, technically a picture book from an American standpoint, is a book that should be no more than 1,000 words, must have illustratable text, which means that the storyline should also be followed by illustrations, because it is often read aloud to little children who don't know how to read. So those are all the rules of it, and they can't be more than 32 pages long. So that is a picture book, and I have written a picture book. I've written 2 picture books, in fact. So I've written picture books already, but each picture book has something to learn. And luckily in India, when you publish, people will give you a little bit of leeway. So for instance, in America, a picture book for children up to the age of 6 or whatever, they'll be very particular about the vocabulary you use. Oh. But when I sold my book, which is about a temple elephant in Kerala called Parvati, the Elephant's Very Important Day, which is an adventure story set in rhyme that I wrote, I introduced 10 Malayalam words, that some of which I had to learn myself. And the reason I did that is because if I was curious to know what is that pom-pom called, what is that fan thing called, what is that, the nettipattam, these are words that other kids may want to know. And they don't have to just be Malayalis. I wrote the book for HarperCollins, and it's a beautifully illustrated picture book, and it's doing well in India, and it's available on Amazon here. It's a book that tells a story of a little temple elephant, but I took some licenses. I wrote about Parvati, a female elephant carrying the Tidamba, which usually in the temple, it's the tuskers that carry it. And so there have been people ask, how come the female elephant is carrying it? And I say, well, why can't the female elephant carry
Absolutely.
it? Why can't women do what men do? So when we have conversations with children, we have that conversation. Can different roles be taken by different people? Do you have to subscribe to these things? And we've had some wonderful, stimulating conversations. So, remember, a book, especially a children's book, is a springboard for storytelling, for further discovery, for further conversation. I truly believe that. And, I'm old enough now that I can say that, and I can say it and have people listen to me. It's true. We can. These are opportunities to learn, and we should continue to do that. And I'll give you one last thing. Anand Nilakantan, who's a Malayali as well, and a very famous writer in India. He's written a lot of mythology and Mahabharata, and he takes he writes stories that are unusual retellings of our Indian classics. He said, and he's more famous though and making lots and lots of money writing screenplays for television. So he's very famous in India, far more than I am. But he and I were on a panel together, and he had written a children's book. And he said, I just want to tell Shobha that writing children's books is a lot harder than writing for adults. Okay. So here's a little stamp for children's books and for your observation.
Absolutely, it certainly is. And you also, and that takes me back to a point you made. You talk about how you must write for a purpose, and it throws light on your own involvement as a writer for the developmental sector. Right. And could you talk about how that has sort of impacted your whole, the course of your storytelling? Because, bringing out these feminist themes via elephants or whatever, as it were.
So, in my first career, as I say, I'm very fortunate that I have a second career now that's doing well. But I worked for over, about 2 decades in nonprofit development, and I worked for an organization that served people with disabilities. I didn't work directly with the people with disabilities, but it was my job as a development director to tell their stories so that we had funders and governments and Department of Education, Department of Rehabilitation, etc., supporting them. I got multi-million-dollar grants to open a branch office for the people we served, for our clients. So what I say is that every field of work that I've done, I'm also a voiceover talent. I use my voice to sell a product or to sell a story or to illustrate a film or to do something, right, as a voiceover talent. All of them, there is a synergy and a connection. When you're writing as a development director, you're selling essentially a need to people, correct? Yes. Or you're selling a purpose. Selling is a dirty word these days. Even in advertising, people say selling. Essentially, what you're doing is telling a story. And we're all telling stories. Similarly, in voiceover work, whether it's a commercial or whether it is a story of a film, you are telling a story. If you use your voice or your words to tell that story in an authentic and honest way, you're more likely to draw people, whether it's a funder or a reader,
yes,
or a listener.
Yeah.
The authentic storytelling, honest storytelling, is what calls people's interest, is what makes it compelling.
Absolutely.
So that is, in some ways, that's the connection.
Yeah.
And of course, nothing is static. As I said, just as a children's book is a springboard for other storytelling, I genuinely believe that nothing is static, that even even a film that I have something to do, using my voice to correct the story in a particular way is doing it a service.
Absolutely. Would you like to read an excerpt from the book on your
So,
mother?
since, Nirmala has been interested in me reading aloud,
Yeah.
I'm going to do something a little unusual.
Yeah.
I'm going to read you a poem from my book, which is for kids of all ages. Of course, I take it mainly to schools and classrooms, but I have talked to adults about it. I've had many, in fact, usually fathers coming to me saying, I'm an engineer and I heard your talk, I loved it. And, I've talked about children's books at Madhurabhumi to huge or other festivals, to very, 1,000 people in the auditorium. A lot of them, 90% of them are adults, and they will come and say that we didn't even know that nonette is a poetic form or something else because we never learnt it in school. So learning can happen at every stage, but I just wanted to read you 2 poems from this. They're both short, and I'll read it fast. One, which I read to some of the kids as well. I do something unusual with this book, and that's why I'm going to read you from this book. I guide children on poetic forms. I introduce 9 poetic forms in this book. Some are a little complicated, like a sonnet, in that it's very specific. A form is something that is structurally has rules to follow. And so it's very specific, and I write it in the form of the poem, and I tell you what the form is in that writing, which is what makes it unusual. But in order to make the book relevant and interesting to children, I then write a poem that's sort of fun. And when it's fun, it resonates with kids, but it follows the same structure. And if it follows the same structure, it liberates children from thinking that a poem is boring or it has to follow a rule, because you can basically write about just anything.
Absolutely.
Right? Which is why this book won the Publishing Next Award, ages 8 to 12 in 2022. And the reason is because so many people are writing children's books. So a book has to surface, it has to do something different.
Yeah.
Let me read you quickly sonnet in iambic pentameter, and then the example, just so you get a sense of what that is. Sorry. Sonnet in iambic pentameter. The sonnet is just a simple poem. Its length is predetermined at the start. 14 lines in total, not a long tome. The octaves 8, the sestet 6 apart. The first 8 lines may rhyme quite easily. The next 6 lines may change repeatedly. Though the meter can vary, I'll show you some sonnets have 5 long beats through and through. Milton, Dante, and the great bard as well, with thoughtful words of life and death did tell. This form they used to express sentiment. They spoke of love and war and merriment. The sonnet is an interesting find, just 14 lines to speak what's on your mind. So we end with an Elizabethan couplet, we follow the octave and the sestet, dividing it from 8 to 8 and then 6, and we follow the da-dum, the long syllable and the short syllable of iambic pentameter. Now here's a sonnet that, unless you knew you were looking for it, you wouldn't even know it was a sonnet, and it's called When Mummy Was Away. I packed my own lunch when Mummy was out, with sweets and treats since she wasn't about. Took out the salad, threw carrots away, put in some cookies, a packet of Lay's. Filled up my thermos with sweet 7-Up, joyfully dreaming of fizz in my cup. Pulled out my sandwich, added some cake. This was a great lunch, I made no mistake. But something went very wrong with my plan. You don't want to look in the garbage can. Through recess, I lay on the ground in pain. I'll never try packing my lunch again. All that sugar gave me a tummy ache. Junk food for lunch is a major mistake.
Oh, so sweet. Lovely.
So, as I said, it's just so that that poem resonates with kids, and then they get a sense that we can also write poetry.
Yeah.
And, we did a poetry workshop earlier today where we all wrote poems.
Yeah.
This is a book that is not for children, but of course anybody can read it again. I always believe that, books are for all ages. Truly they are.
Absolutely.
In fact, because I'm writing children's books and now I'm writing a middle grade book, which is for older children, I've been reading middle grade books, which it's not my normal writing and reading. And it's been so much fun because it's so clever and it's so interesting. And I thought, this isn't an easy thing to do either. Because you have to sustain the story, you've got to do things differently. And I just read a book, if anybody wants a recommendation, called Kareem Between, which has now been shortlisted for the National Book Award in America in the children's section. And it's a story written by a Syrian-American lady. It talks about a middle school boy who wants to join the football team, which is a very American sort of feeling. I don't know anything about football, but it doesn't matter. I mean, I don't mean soccer, the American football. This kid wants to be. And what the writer has done, which is so interesting, is she's used the language of football for all her page headings. You know, I mean, skirmish, and I don't remember those words, but whatever it is, throwing the ball and, doing this and doing that. And she's written it, it's actually like a 200-page book, but there's only about 6 lines in each page, because it's almost like the movement of a ball or something. So it's not exactly poetry, but you could call it unrhymed poetry. And each page is that way. And she tells the story in which she uses the forum to talk about immigration, to talk about Trump's no Muslim ban, the Muslim ban. She, without saying Trump or anything else, she talks about the Muslim ban, she talks about immigration, she talks about children in America who come from a different country, who feel that they're in between, that they don't really belong in one world or the other, that they don't speak either language well. All of the sort of things that a lot of our kids may be going through. So look at the responsibility that that writer has taken to tell a story. That's someone else's story. But I'm just telling you, that's what children's books can do to you.
Absolutely.
Now, this is a book for adults that Penguin wanted me to write. They came to me and said, we'll give you lots of money, will you write your mother's biography? And I turned around and I said, you only want my mother's biography because she's Shobha Tharoor's mother. I'm not going to write it. And I said, no. And they kept coming back to me, increasing the advance they'll give and all this other business, and said, so many people will want to read this book, etc. And so, I once mentioned it at lunchtime when I was having lunch with my brother, and he said, hey, write it. It's a challenge. Why don't you do it? So I still was very irritated that, they want the story because they want to know more about my brother. So I instead made a proposition. I went to them and I said, okay, I'll write my mother's biography. It'll follow the timeline of birth till today. She's still alive. And I thought of it as, I have my nephew here and his partner, and it's just lovely that I have kids who would also enjoy reading this book about their Amamal. And it's a book that I thought that I could give as a gift to my family. Plus, it's a book that that my mother has inspired all of us in so many different ways. I wanted to write a book that in some ways was like a self-help book as well. So I wrote up a proposal to the publisher and I said, okay, I'll make this a short book. It'll be a book that follows the timeline of a memoir. It'll tell all the important stories of her life. But each chapter will have a takeaway, like I have in my children's books. And each chapter will be an opportunity for us to learn something so that the book resonates with people of her generation who know Lily and so therefore will see themselves in it, or for people of the next generation who may wish to share the book with their growing up children. All of us have to learn in so many different ways from this book. So they bought the idea, and that's how I wrote the book. So the book is written in simple, propulsive prose. I have deliberately constructed it so that the book is written entirely by me. But if you read the book, you will hear Lily's voice in the beginning of the chapter is as though she's thinking aloud. And then the third-person narrator is weaving together what do you learn from it in some ways, without hitting it on the head. So when we talked about educating or instructing, if you do that to a reader, then they're not that interested. You've got to sort of have them infer and pick things up from it on their own, whatever the age. So I'll just read you a little bit, just so you hear my mother's voice a little bit, to get a sense of an adult book so that it's a little bit different from a children's book. Sorry, I wasn't sure I was reading aloud, so I haven't marked it. so this is, just like V.S. Naipaul's A House for Mr. Bishwas, the need to build a home is there in all of us. My father died at a very early age, and he worked in the newspaper business, or he was an advertising director for a newspaper and then a magazine. We were not business people, etc. My parents owned little flats as investments, but they didn't have a home of their own. So this is about that, okay? The achievement I am most proud of was building my Lily cottage in Kovaipudur, a beautiful suburb in the outskirts of the city and closer to Palakkad and my mother. I had always wanted an independent house and described my ideas to the architect for him to draw on paper. Then I contacted a builder. The upper floor of the house had a separate entrance so that I could rent that portion and earn a monthly income. I thought it was an ingenious plan. The ground floor had a large room where I could gather my friends and devotees for Sai bhajans. This was something I had always wanted to do. With God's grace, I managed it all on my own. My children had wanted me to buy a flat, which would be safer and easier to maintain. But I needed to build this house with the front courtyard for the tulsi to grow and grace the house. This was a dream that I had had for a long time, and I was able to fulfill it. I really enjoyed and appreciated my mother's frequent visits when she stayed with me in my Lily cottage. We were both strong, opinionated women. Though she didn't say it directly to me, I know that she was impressed by what I had built on my own. I lived in the house with only part-time help and drove the 90-minute distance on my own to Mundarat to spend a few days with my mother every month. My 3 children made the effort to come from abroad every other year with their children and stayed with me in this house as well. But I had only lived a few years in my Lily cottage when the house was robbed while I was away on a meditation retreat. I feel the watchman must have partnered with the thief to have planned this robbery so cleverly. Anyway, after that robbery, I did not have the courage to live in the house alone. Our past experience as landlords made me wary of renting the house to a tenant. I asked a friend to find me a buyer right away. Shashi thinks I made a point to build the place because I wanted to prove to myself that I could do it. He said that once I had done the job to my satisfaction, I sold the house. Perhaps he is right.
Oh.
So those are, that's a chapter of one of the chapters, which is in her voice. And then the narrator continues on about the rest of the journey and that part of the timeline.
Yeah, that's lovely.
Thank you.
Beautiful adult writing as well. Yeah.
Thank you.
And talking of Shashi, I was listening to one of your interviews, you and Shashi, in a session at MBIFL, where he calls you at the Matrubhumi Literature Festival, where he calls you together at a session. I was just looking. I just found something on the tube. And he calls you a late bloomer.
I took offense at that.
Yeah. But then you have proved that it's never too late to bloom.
Well, to be honest with you, he got told off for that later by both my sister and for me, because clearly he did not value the development work that I did as much as he should have.
Yeah.
And the fact that I was doing something different always, the role of a parent is also a blooming job in many different ways, and that's pun intended.
Yeah.
There's a great deal to do. The role, any job we do, if we take it seriously, is an opportunity to bloom. What he meant is that he had always thought, I found an old letter of my father, and my father died 30 years ago. And it was really interesting. On his death anniversary, one of the things I do is I have a little box. He used to write to me. Those days, it was $12 a minute for me to call India, and I couldn't afford it. And we used to write each other letters, and he used to number his letters so I knew which one was coming next, and take 10 days, 2 weeks for letters to come. And the ones that I had got just a few years before he died, I put in a box. And every year I pick up a letter that I may not have read in a while and read it. And it was very interesting. It's almost like he's up there telling me things. I picked up a letter that he had written in which he said, "Oh, I love the way you write your stories. You would be such a good writer for children or for adults." And it was written in his letter in 1992.
Wow.
So we're talking years ago. I'm just thinking, the ability to write. And I wrote through college. I was writing for the college newspaper. I had to write very many compelling technical grants as a nonprofit writer. So writing was there always. The blooming for getting books published is what he meant.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So that's what it takes me back to all your talents as a voiceover talent, as a writer, both skills that have the ability to draw audiences into a kind of world that you wish to paint for them,
Right.
Which medium of storytelling do you think is more powerful, the written or the verbal?
I think both are important. And that's an interesting question. You know what I do as a voiceover talent, which actually I started doing voiceovers even before I was published. It's just that because of the national award in India, I've become more well known as a voiceover talent. But I was doing it for years, and I still do it, both in America and abroad. Is it time for Q&A?
Yes.
Oh.
Yeah. No, finish.
I'll just finish this.
Yeah.
I read aloud every single book I write before I send it to the publisher. And I tell even children who write, read aloud your sentences, even if it's not poetry, because you can catch your errors in the cadence of the reading. Music is there in all words. You don't need a rhyme scheme to have musical words. I love the sound of words. I had written a short essay and sent it to KQED in San Francisco, which is public television. They had a series called Perspective. And I talked about, I've loved words ever since I was a little child. That's how that thing starts. And they invited me to put it on the radio, so I went and recorded it. In fact, that started my voiceover career because I went and read it aloud, and they had said to me, the voiceover engineer said, this has to be only 2 minutes or something, so you have to write something that's no more than 300 words. Okay, so they have the time limit. I read it in 2 minutes and 1 second. So he asked me, "Are you a professional voice talent?" So I said, "No." And he said, "Well, wow, you really nailed it." He said, "We never have anybody be able to read within a time limit as well as that." Now, that was a compliment, but that's when sort of jogged my memory that, I used to win elocution contests and all these other things. I said, maybe I can do some voiceover work, and so I started doing it. Because I have stories to tell.
Yeah, I love the enthusiasm. I don't think you should ever grow up, and that's what keeps you so young. So with that, shall we open the
We're opening it up to questions.
Any
Does
questions?
Need a mic? It's a large cavernous hall, so please have mics so I won't be able to hear you. Thank you.
How do you rate self-publishing against normal traditional publishing?
Well, initially it was a sort of an ego thing. I've never self-published. I've been very fortunate that I did get rejections, but I would pitch to publishers and they picked it up and they gave me monies and, all of that. And so I got the heft of having a publishing house behind my work. Now, the advantage of the heft of a publishing house is that, especially in India, I've been published by the biggest publishers in India. And so as a result of it, they have marketing teams and sales teams. So I don't have to do as much to sell my books. I won an award with one of the books that I published in America as well, but it was a small children's press. I had to write to friends, I had to write to libraries, I had to go around trying to sell my book. But there was no sales team, nothing. They gave me an advance, they published my book, but then selling of the book sort of fell on me, and I didn't really have time, and then it was pandemic time, all that kind of thing. So it's not that I don't rate the quality if you self-publish. I know many writers who have self-published. In fact, Shehan Karunathilika, who is a Booker Prize-winning writer, he came to MBIFL and he attended one of my events. I heard him speak. He's a wonderful writer. I mean, a little obscure in some. I mean, I never read Chinaman, but cricket and all that. But the thing is, I've read his short stories and I loved them. He's very zany and interesting. I've met him more than once. He said that he sent, because he was in a small island, as he puts it, in Sri Lanka, he didn't know anybody and they had only limited publishers. He sent it without knowing anyone. Nobody bought his book, Chinaman, the first time, and he self-published the book. Later on, some of his other work started doing well, and then publishers came to him and republished it. As I said, the advantage of not self-publishing is that you get the heft of all of that. In terms of quality, and I'm sorry I have to say this, a lot of people, I remember in the beginning, my brother, because he writes and he's also a politician and he's a very famous man, thousands of people are sending books to him for a blurb or a reading or a review, most of which he doesn't have time to do. But we do get a lot of self-published books, and I have to say, some of it is actual junk. So you can have lack of quality in self-publishing because you have the right, whatever you say, you may think it's good enough, and then you go ahead and publish it as a vanity project. So if you are not a good enough editor of your work, if you are not a good enough critic of your work, if you haven't shared it with people and had enough feedback, and then you're self-publishing your book, you're putting something out there into the world that probably doesn't need to be there. So that's my long answer. Any other questions?
I love the fact that you did this workshop, and I was really glad to see there were at least some kids who were present. And being the parent of one kid who is slightly older right now, who used to write a lot, one thing that went by the wayside was this writing once they get hooked onto these devices and all. So what do you have any suggestions as to how to keep them engaged and interested in order to, number one, reading is okay, they can read books, but also actually writing.
I'm sorry, but I'm not really able to understand what you're saying, and I'm not sure if the mic is too close to you or I'm losing my hearing, but I didn't. What was the question again?
Is this better? Can you hear me now?
Yeah, that's better.
Okay, all right. I said, how do you keep these kids engaged throughout? Right now it is between, the ages of 6 to 12 or whatever. But after that also, once they reach that teenage where they get involved in a lot of other things, including sports as well as online stuff.
How do I encourage somebody of an older age to read?
Yeah.
Is that what you're saying?
Read, and not just that, and to write as well.
Absolutely right. When you say to write, the one thing that if you want to write and if you have an interest in writing, you need to be able to read. And of course, we are all able to read, but you need to be interested in reading. It's not an original thought. You all know that. The more we read, the more we have an idea of both sentence construction, ideas, vocabulary, craft, different ways of telling stories, different ways of writing poetry. So reading in the genre that you want to write is the first thing you have to do. And I always tell children's parents, when I go out there and I'm out there talking to teachers or parents who ask this question all the time, I say, forcing children to read what you want them to read is a big mistake. So reading should be something that should come from within. I don't believe that children will not enjoy reading books. I believe they haven't found the right book to read. And I'm not saying those books are necessarily my books. A lot of children have fantasy. They want to read about mythology. My son, for instance, used to read so much mythology as a child because that's what interested him. So instead of telling him, no, why don't you try to read other kinds of books, we used to just get him, illustrated mythology books. But I introduced him to Greek mythology in addition to Indian mythology. You can do that as a parent or as an adult, different kinds of mythology, because those adventure stories, larger-than-life heroes, those were the kind of things that interested him. Today, he's probably reading other kinds of stuff. But encouraging children to read what interests them is good. I say this about poetry as well. There's what we call poetry of the classroom and poetry of the playground. It's the same thing with books. If children want to read comic books or graphic novels, that's fine too, if that's how you're starting out. So, if children want to read Shel Silverstein for poetry, which is zany and fun and sometimes nonsensical, like Dr. Seuss, that's cool too. You don't have to read only William Wordsworth and Tennyson. I loved William Wordsworth and Tennyson, but somebody else may not. Yeah. So that is one way to get started. And that's the same even if they're teenagers, If they're teenage stories, if they want to read pulpy romance to get started with reading, that's fine, because I'm sure an intelligent, discerning reader, after reading, I read Mills and Boon when I was a kid, and I remember my brother used to laugh at me. I was about 12 or 13 years old when we were allowed to start reading them, and we used to hide and read them. But after you've read about 5 or 10 of those books, they all sound exactly the same, and they're so boring that you don't want to read it. So a thoughtful, intelligent reader is going to want to toss those away and want to read something else. So your homework is already done for you if you let them read that to begin with. So once that the habit of reading becomes part of you, where you don't just want passive entertainment of watching shows or something else, you're actually enjoying the written word. It's, because when you read a book, it stays with you a lot longer than something else. I'm sure, I don't know, but I personally feel I can't imagine a video game is going to stay with you as long as a good book that you've read. I could be wrong, but it's, one is a passive activity, the other you're using your imagination.
Yeah, I think the time's up.
Time's
You've
up.
rung the bell a few
Thank
times.
you.
Thank you. But maybe the next book would be My Brother and I or something like that. Never.
But I do thank him
for
inspiring me always.
Thank you for that wonderful conversation. It was wonderful to hear from you, Ma'am Shobha Tharoor, like how you can have meaningful conversations with your children, even if you're just reading a picture book with them. So as a mother, I find it more inspiring to discover more together with my kids and using book as a tool to connect more with them.